Deep in the mountains of Shikoku, there is a valley so steep that for centuries, mapmakers simply left it blank. No roads reached it, no official records described it in detail, and yet people lived there, in wooden houses clinging to slopes so sharp that farmers had to be tied to ropes just to harvest their own fields. The only way across the gorge was a bridge woven entirely from mountain vines, swaying over a river more than 100 feet below, with no metal, no nails, nothing but plant fiber holding it together. And that was the point. Because this bridge wasn't built to make the journey easier. It was built so that if enemies ever came looking for the people hiding here, the vines could be cut in seconds, and the only way in would disappear. This is Iya Valley, and the story of why anyone needed a bridge they could destroy on command begins with one of the most famous defeats in Japanese history. If places like this, where geography itself becomes a form of survival, fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, subscribe, because Hidden Japan has many more valleys like this one, still waiting to be explored. In the year 1185, one of the most powerful clans in Japan lost everything. The Heike, also known as the Taira, had ruled much of the country for a generation. Then, at the naval Battle of Dan-no-ura, their fleet was destroyed, their young emperor drowned, and the clan that had once controlled the imperial court was effectively wiped from power in a single afternoon. Official history says the surviving Heike were hunted down in the years that followed. But local tradition in Iya tells a different ending. It says that a small number of Heike survivors didn't die at Dan-no-ura at all.
Instead, they fled inland, deeper and deeper into the mountains of Shikoku, until the terrain itself became too dangerous for anyone to follow, and they simply stopped running. There's no definitive documentary proof that connects any specific Iya family directly to the historical Heike court, but the legend has survived here for over 800 years, passed down almost unchanged, in a place where almost nothing else about the outside world managed to reach for centuries. And once you see the valley itself, it's not hard to understand why they might have chosen it. Iya isn't just remote, it's geologically extreme. The valley was carved by the Iya River, cutting through some of the steepest gorges in Japan, with slopes so severe that until surprisingly recently, there were stretches with no proper road at all, only footpaths along cliff edges and rope and vine bridges crossing the gaps where the mountains simply refused to be crossed on foot. The most famous of these bridges still exists today, rebuilt every few years using the exact same technique, mountain vine called shirakuchi-kazura, woven and layered by hand into a walkway wide enough for a single person, suspended above the river with wooden slats spaced far enough apart that you can see straight through to the water below with every step. Local guides sometimes joke that the gaps were left wide on purpose, a subtle deterrent to spies who weren't used to mountain life. Whether that detail is fact or folklore passed down alongside it, one thing is documented. The design was practical in a way few bridges anywhere in the world have ever needed to be, because vine, unlike wood or stone, can be cut through by hand in moments.
If soldiers ever did climb this far into the mountains, the people of Iya had a way to make the entire valley unreachable within minutes. The bridge wasn't just infrastructure, it was a weapon of last resort, one that required nothing but a knife and the will to use it. For centuries, that isolation shaped everything about life in Iya. The valley's slopes are too steep for conventional rice paddies, so the people here developed something almost nowhere else in Japan relied on so heavily: dry field agriculture on terraces cut directly into the mountainside, growing buckwheat, potatoes, and a local variety of vegetable called iya soba that thrives where flooded rice fields simply can't exist. Houses were built with thick thatched roofs and deep eaves to survive brutal mountain winters, clustered in tiny hamlets along ridgelines rather than valley floors, because the valley floor belonged to the river, and the river here has never been gentle. Even farming itself required a kind of engineering most of Japan never needed. Some of the steepest fields were worked using ropes anchored to trees above, farmers essentially rappelling across their own crops to plant and harvest without sliding into the gorge below. It's a level of everyday risk that's almost impossible to picture from the outside, and for the people who grew up here, it was simply what a normal working day looked like.
By the early 20th century, Iya had developed a reputation, even within Japan, as one of the country's most isolated inhabited places. Some writers called it Japan's own hidden Tibet, not because of any cultural connection, but because of how completely the mountains sealed it off from the rest of the country. That isolation is also, in a strange way, what preserved it.
Because roads came late to Iya, some of the valley's remotest hamlets weren't properly connected until well into the post-war era. Traditions that vanished elsewhere in Japan during rapid 20th century modernization survived here largely untouched. The vine bridges are the most famous example, but they're far from the only one. Local festivals tied to the mountain calendar, traditional thatching techniques, and even certain dialect words that have disappeared from standard Japanese are still spoken by the valley's oldest residents. And then there's Nagoro, in a side valley not far from the main gorge, where an elderly resident began making life-size scarecrows to replace neighbors who had died or moved away, until eventually there were more scarecrow figures populating the empty schoolyard and roadside than living people. It's become its own strange, quietly haunting symbol of what depopulation looks like when a community refuses to simply disappear without a trace. Iya, like so much of rural Japan, is emptying out. At its peak, the wider Iya region held several thousand residents, scattered across dozens of mountain hamlets. Today, many of those hamlets have dwindled to a handful of elderly residents, or none at all. Roofs have collapsed. Terraced fields that once required literal ropes to farm have gone to forest. And yet the vine bridges are still rebuilt, every 3 years, by hand, using techniques passed down for generations. Not because anyone still needs to cut them down to survive an invasion, but because the valley refuses to let that particular thread of its identity break. There's something quietly moving about that.
A defense mechanism built to protect fleeing warriors 8 centuries ago, kept alive today not out of necessity, but out of a kind of stubborn, collective memory. Standing on the bridge itself, looking down through the gaps in the vine at the river far below, it's difficult not to think about who might have crossed this exact spot centuries ago, exhausted, hunted, hoping the mountains on the other side would finally be far enough. Personally, I find it remarkable that a legend this specific, cut the bridge and the enemy cannot follow, has survived for 800 years in a form you can still physically walk across today. Most legends fade into vague stories. This one built infrastructure that still exists, rebuilt every few years by people who may or may not be descended from the very story they're preserving. And perhaps that's the most astonishing part of all. Nobody in Iya today can prove with certainty that their ancestors were the Heike survivors of the story. DNA doesn't confirm court lineage from 8 centuries ago, and written records from that era are famously incomplete. But the valley behaves as though the story is true. The bridges are cuttable by design. The hamlets are hidden by geography. The isolation that could have simply been unfortunate geology has instead become identity, a place that still, in some sense, feels like it's ready to disappear at a moment's notice, exactly the way it was built to. Whether or not a single Heike samurai ever set foot on this exact crossing, Iya Valley remains one of the clearest physical reminders in all of Japan that sometimes the deepest history isn't written down in a temple archive. Sometimes it's woven, quite literally, into vines, rebuilt every 3 years by hands that refuse to let the story end.
Iya is not the only place in Japan where a defeat became a legend, and a legend became a landscape. Somewhere else, behind a shrine gate that floats only at high tide, at the end of a railway line that climbs into the clouds, inside a village that quietly decided to disappear, another hidden story is still waiting. The deeper you go into Japan, the more it feels like the country is made of secrets stacked on top of secrets. We're going looking for the next one.